Hello, and welcome to the second episode of the trilogy on killer cops. Not all serial killers are psychopaths, and not all psychopaths are serial killers. When a serial killer says he killed because he was bored, psychopathy should enter the equation. But does it not also mask a deeper subconscious trauma? South African serial killer and rapist Kobus Geldenhuys. His criminal career began when he was stealing money from his mother's purse at the age of 10 years old. Geldenhuys developed no psychological inhibitors to prevent the thing, as he called it, from escalating from stealing his mother's money to burglary to rape and eventually to murder. And shocking as it might sound, Kobus Geldenhuys was a police officer, but he was invisible. As I only joined the police in the South African police force in 1994, I never interviewed Kobus Geldenhuys personally. But I later had insight into the notes of the criminologist who had evaluated him, and I discussed his case with Warrant Officer Leon Nell, one of the two detectives that investigated him, and I read the court reports. I was also in regular contact with Janine Lazarus, the brave crime journalist from the Sunday Star newspaper, who was prepared to endanger her own life to arrest the Norwood rapist terrorizing her neighborhood. Janine visited Kobus in prison several times, and she just wrote the book called Bait to Catch a Killer. Please buy the book, explaining the harrowing effect that this had on her life. My colleague and successor, Dr. Gerard Labuschagne, also interviewed Kobus over a couple of years in prison. All of these people agreed to the lack of emotions in this man, who did not fit the public's perception that a serial rapist or serial killer could look like a vicious monster. All of them commented on his slight, overweight body, his puffy hands, and his almost soft brown eyes. That is, until one gazes more deeply and you find there is no depth, just the deadpan nothingness of the abyss. Kobus said he could read emotions on other people's faces, but it was looking through a glass window pane. He could never feel them. His emotions was dead. So how did he become the invisible man? Growing up in a home as an only child with an emotionally absent father and a domineering but equally emotionally absent mother who was convinced that her home was possessed by the devil, Kobus said he was lonely. He disliked his parents. His father complied with his duty to provide for his family, but he never played with him. His mother cared for his basic needs. She gave him food and she gave him clothing, but she never showed affection. He felt isolated. His mother also did not allow him to go out unsupervised, so he could not really bond with any friends. So he was never physically or sexually molested or abused, but he was emotionally neglected. His emotional development was never kick-started. Now, neuroscientists have established through fMRI scans that social pain and rejection impair the structural integrity of the anterior cingulate cortex. This is our ability to develop a moral code based upon empathy and caring compassion for other human beings. Kobus, who admitted, "I don't do emotions," could at best describe his childhood as lonely. The words rejection, isolation, and neglect would never even register on his deprived social radar. Kobus's parents described him as a well-behaved child, but they never really saw him. Trying to capture his mother's attention by stealing from her purse when he was 10 years old did not work. Now, the attachment theory psychologist would recognize this as an exploitation, as moving against people. But eventually it didn't work, and Kobus came up and he became detached from people, moving away from people. So he was not recognized as a human being. He was invisible. Kobus needed some kind of excitement to alleviate the absolute apathy that ruled his life. Psychopaths often seek thrilling jobs to get an adrenaline rush. This makes them feel alive and it counters the emotional void. So after applying for and being rejected by the Navy, the South African police, and even the post office, Kobus was finally accepted by the railway police. Then with the amalgamation of the railway police and the South African police force, he eventually became a policeman. And later, he was transferred to the Internal Stability Unit in Alexandra, which was responsible for keeping peace in a very hostile community. Now, the 1980s in South Africa was very turbulent times, both for the young policemen and for the young activists in the townships. Heavily armed police vehicles would patrol the streets and would be daily bombarded with petrol bombs and other projectiles. And both these parties would often exchange fire. And nobody was allowed to report on this. I was a journalist at that stage because there was a state of emergency declared by the government. Now, to most men on either side of these battles, it was very traumatic. Kobus described this time in his life as boring. So on the 12th of May 1989, he was bored at playing computer games at his parents' home, and he hopped over the fence and he encountered the housekeeper, 21-year-old Miss Francina Tunzi, in her pajamas. He pushed her back into her room when she saw him and she screamed, and he attacked her and assaulted her with a brick. We don't know if she was raped because he set her room on fire. So this was a murder of opportunity, and it remained unsolved until he later confessed to it. By 1991, he was living in the Norwood barracks of the police station. On the 2nd of November in 1991, he was bored with watching television and he went for a walk. He passed the Grantwood Close apartment and he spotted an open window. He climbed through the window and he stole 13 CDs and he returned back to the barracks. So the following night, he went out again because he was bored. And this time, he chose an apartment block directly next to the barracks. He climbed through the open window, he stole 4 CDs, a CD player and 2 speakers. And this was the flat of 37-year-old Miss F. So he stole her BMW car keys, took the car for a joyride, and the next day calmly parked the car in the parking space and threw the keys through the window. So the following evening, on the 6th of November 1991, he returned to Miss F's apartment. He found her in bed, he undressed himself, and he switched on the light. And when she woke up and asked him what he wanted, he raped her. And after that, he told her to pull the duvet covering her face, which she did, and he left through the window. She also asked him if he was scared, and he said no, he didn't care. The psychopaths do not feel fear. 20 days later, on the 26th of November 1991, he was bored again. He strolled around the neighborhood and he noticed a handbag through the window of a ground floor apartment in Grand Close. He climbed through the window and he stole 50 rand from the handbag. He saw a woman sitting in the lounge, but she did not notice him. He was invisible. He left the apartment silently and went back to his quarters. But later that night, he returned. And a 68-year-old woman, Miss M, woke up to find him standing next to his bed. When she saw him and screamed, he hit her with a pistol, and then after that, he raped her. Then he kissed her, he raped her again, and then he got dressed and he threw a blanket over her face. He wished her good night and he left through the window. So although he derived some kind of enjoyment from sneaking into people's homes, especially when they were there, and from the burglary, he admitted that it was not enough to satisfy his adrenaline urge. He thought about raping the woman, but it was only when he was issued the service pistol, he said, that he felt powerful enough. Now this reminds me of episode 1 of our killer cop, Aisel and Nell, whose identity and self-worth was linked to his firearm, and also of Velapi Lamandla, our serial killer, the saloon killer. So within a few months, breaking and entering and raping women was not enough. So Kobus escalated to murder. 20 days later, on the 16th of December in 1991, he entered the home of 27-year-old Julia Market Hetchy in Shipstone Lane. He could not see properly, so he switched on the light. She awoke, and when she saw him, that's when he decided she has to die. He hit her with a pistol, he raped the stunned woman, and then he shot her in cold blood through her temple, obliterating her face. 2 weeks later, on the 30th of December 1991, he entered the second-floor apartment of another complex right next to the barracks. He moved to the bedroom and he switched on the light. And then that is when 27-year-old Jennifer Matfield saw him and she screamed. He hit her with a pistol against the head and he stripped her and he raped her. And then he told her to take a bath, which she did. He went to her room, dressed himself, went back, stood in the bathroom door smoking a cigarette, aimed the firearm at her. She turned her head and he shot her at the back of her head again, obliterating her face. By this time, the news of the Norwood serial rapist or serial killer had hit the media. Detectives had traced the footprints to the barracks and the fingerprints were found in Jenny's crime scene. Now, then it was expected of all the men in the barracks to be fingerprinted. And Kobus decided that he would give himself up then, but nobody came to fingerprint them. So once again, Kobus in his police uniform was invisible. On the 7th of May 1992, he moved from Norwood to the neighborhood where his ex-fiance's parents lived, and entered the apartment of 74-year-old Miss Susanna van Rach. He switched the light on and off, and he fetched a torch. And of course, she awoke when he switched the light on and she saw him. She screamed, and he hit her with a pistol. She grabbed his hands and he shot her in the face, obliterating her identity. On the afternoon of 15 July 1992, when he was home, he was bored and he jumped a few fences into a neighbor's yard. The house belonged to Miss Taylor, who shared it with her 16-year-old daughter, Veronica. He raped Veronica on bed. And he took the pistol and then he shot her point blank in the forehead, and it was a star wound. He later said the star-shaped wound fascinated him. Again, he obliterated her. Now, Veronica's case was investigated by Warrant Officer Lionel of the East Rand murder and robbery, but the post-mortem was conducted by Dr. Vernon Kemp, who also conducted the Norwood post-mortems, and he suspected this was the same man. So he called in both detectives, Miles and Nell, and they were both convinced that their suspect was a policeman. So Kobus was finally arrested by Warrant Officer Miles, who'd been hunting him for months. He admitted also to switching his service pistol with one in the armory. And after his arrest, the discrepancy regarding his DNA was also cleared up. Some serial killers, like Kobus Geldenhuys, Andre Chikatilo, and the UK's John Duffy, the railway ripper, have different blood types than that is found in their semen. Kobus had no sense of self-preservation, and he would leave evidence on the crime scenes, almost wanting to be caught. However, this was never enough for him to actually give himself up. He did thank Miles for arresting him, and he admitted he would never be able to stop himself. On the 24th of September 1993, Mr. Judges Kluter passed 5 death sentences on Kobus. In the meantime, they were converted to life sentence. So he's currently still serving the life sentence, and his last parole application in 2020 was denied. Kobus Geldenhuys should never be paroled. He will kill again. He said so himself. He also told my colleague, Dr. Gerard Labuschagne, if he ever gets out, he wants to work on a cruise ship. That ship has sailed, Kobus. So Kobus Geldenhuys wanted to be acknowledged as a human with emotions by his parents, mostly by his mother. He wanted her to see him. When he forced his victims to finally see him by switching on the light, it was too late, and he obliterated their faces in cold blood, taking their identity, as he was never really acknowledged as an identity. A childhood fantasy of the invisible man was coming to light in the flash of a gun. If you like our videos, please give us your thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. If you are truly interested in forensic profiling and want to find out the real psychology behind Kobus Geldenhuys and his attachment traumas, then join my Patreon community by clicking on the QR code. See you next week in the 3rd episode of the trilogy on South African killer cops.